Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman Soni. In today's news hour, we shall be discussing the important articles related to economy from the Hindu newspaper. Page 1, RBI surprises with 40 basis point rate increase. 1% is equals to 100 basis points. So 40 basis points is 0.4 percentage increase. Finally, after almost 45 months, the RBI has increased the repo rate, and the reason for that is the high inflation which is alarming in the economy. Earlier, we have seen about how the RBI was going for the accommodative stance, and even now the RBI has preserved the accommodative stance. That is, in future it is going to reduce the inflation rate or it is going to keep inflation rate the same. And here you can see on the graph, after a long period of almost 45 months, the RBI has increased the rate 4.4 percentage. And the main reason is the alarming and high inflation that the economy is going because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because of the increase in raw material prices, increase in the crude oil prices, and the US federal rate policy changes. All these have repercussions on the Indian economy, and we are seeing a imported inflation. And even in the Indian economy, because of the increase in petrol and diesel prices, the overall logistical costs have increased. And when the logistical costs have, it will have impact on all the sectors of the economy, and the retail prices also would be impacted. That is why we are seeing a sudden high inflation in the economy, and now RBI has realized that it is time to control the and various reasons are the sanctions and retaliatory actions, the sanctions imposed on Russia and the retaliatory actions by the Russia on the Europe, shortages, volatility in the commodity markets, volatility in the financial markets because of all these conflicts, supply chain disruptions, and fall in output of various commodities. All this is leading to high inflation. And at the same time, now currently even the COVID cases are increasing again. Probably we might see again or another wave. So the RBI thought that it is high time to increase the inflation rate so that the fundamentals of the economy remain the same. There is stability in the economy. And along with that, the RBI also increased the cash reserve ratio. What happens when we increase the cash reserve ratio? The amount of loan that the banks have to give it as loans will reduce when we increase the cash reserve ratio. So because the amount of loans will be dispersed will be low, the liquidity supply in the entire economy will come down, and that is how the RBI is planning to control the editorial page. This article also talks about the same inflation rate. Let's look at it. The editorial says that the economic cost of not having price stability would be worse than not having low cost credit. Yes, because of the high inflation and there is no price stability, that would impact the economy more than providing low cost credit to kickstart the demand and increase the investments. So in the order of preference, if you are going to go for providing low cost credit and increasing investments and going for price stability, we'll have to look in for price stability, because without price stability there cannot be any business. And even if you are giving low cost credit, if there is no price stability and the economy is not performing well, the investor would not want to borrow the amount even if he is getting the interest rate is a lower rate. Even if he is getting the loan at a lower interest rate, he might not take it because the entire economy is reeling under the pressure. And especially inflation will affect the vulnerable sections more, because major part of the income of the poor people will be spent on consumption of food items. So if the inflation increases in the overall economy, the retail prices of all the goods and services increases. Now the poor person has to put in more amount for this consumption expenditure. Because of the increase in prices, a more amount of his income will go towards consumption, and to that extent his amount of income for other users has reduced. And this doesn't happen in the case of rich person, because the more the income you get, your consumption will marginally increase. But after a certain point of time, even the richest person, how much can he consume? So he will put more of his income on investments and other users. For the poor person, the major component of its income will be spent on consumption, and any increase in inflation will have a direct impact on its purchasing power. When the previously the Federal Bank of USA, they are going for policy normalization, and at the same time we have been seeing about the capital flow volatility. When the yields in the USA market are changing, the foreign portfolio investments from the Indian markets happens. When the foreign portfolio investors go out of the Indian market, the demand for dollar increases and the exchange rate of the rupee, the value of the rupee depreciates. So the inflation will have indirect impact on the outflow of the rupees and the exchange rate, and the exchange rate has the stability on of our exports, and the exports have the impact on our earning ability, our balance of payments, and it will have finally impact on the fiscal deficit and current account deficit. So you can see that everything is related, and any impact in one aspect of the economy will have repercussions effect on the other aspects of the economy as well. That's about this article, wherein the RBI is now finally looking into control the inflation, which is going beyond the normal range. This article here talks about the economic crisis in. The basic idea is that currently, even though the Sri Lankan government is going through financial crisis, we should not conclude and come to a conclusion that the crisis is similar to what is happening in Sri Lanka. This article is about Nepal, and the Nepal crisis is just a crisis as of now, and it is not as worse as what it is in Sri Lanka. That is what this article is trying to justify. Currently, we have been seeing the increase in trade deficit, and it is going to reach almost $18 billion for the Nepal, and because of the increase in trade deficit, the balance of payment deficit also happens, and the country's inflation almost increased to 7.14 percentage point, which was the highest in almost 67 months, and the country's debt to GDP ratio also increased, and the decrease in the remittance inflow and the fall in the country's foreign exchange reserves. So you can see, just like Sri Lanka, Nepal is also going through all the financial crisis which Sri Lanka is also experiencing. But at the same time, we cannot come to a conclusion that it is at the same level of that of Sri Lanka, because fundamentally both the economies are different. Even though they are basically dependent on tourism sector, they are mainly dependent on remittances. Nepal is slightly situated differently from Sri Lanka in terms of the politics, in terms of the parties, in terms of the trade with India. So let's go into the details. So what should the government do now in order to get the situation back in control? They have to rationalize the government spending. They should not spend it on wasteful expenditure. They have to minimize the establishment costs. And previously the government had imposed a ban on luxury goods, and the number of working hours was also. But if you don't have an alternative good produced for the luxury goods in your, what would that ban mean? That ban would not mean anything, because then people will go for smuggling. The person who wants to consume the luxury good, who wants to say purchase a luxury car, he won't just wait for the government ban to lift. Probably this will increase grey market and black market, and it will increase the smuggling. So what the government has to do before it is banning any import, it has to make sure that there is an domestic alternative available. And thanks to the increasing ease of the lockdowns, now the tourism sector is slowly picking up. Because of this, the foreign remittances and the foreign exchange of Nepal is also. And another reason for the situation in Nepal is the politics, wherein the conflict between the government and the Central Bank of Nepal, that is the Nepal Rashtra Bank. And because of various power struggles happening between the government and the Nepal Rashtra Bank, whatever the suggestions of the Nepal Rashtra Bank, that is not been taken care by the Finance Ministry of Nepal, and whatever is the mandate of the Finance Ministry, the Nepal's governor of this Nepal Rashtra Bank, he is not doing that. And even though they are seeing high inflation, BOP deficit, decreasing remittances inflow, decreasing foreign exchanges, and increasing imports, at the same time we cannot conclude that this will lead to a disaster just like the Sri Lankan economy. Even India went through a crisis in 1991, and the article says that it is time for Nepal to follow the path of India, and how India boomed in after the 1991 crisis. How we used that 1991 foreign exchange crisis to grow to this level. Recently, the Nepal's parliament has approved a $500 million Millennium Challenge Corporation grant from the United States. This Millennium Challenge Corporation grant will help it increase its energy cooperation between various countries. For example, India, UK, etc. So the article says that the country must actively reduce its dependence on China and increase its dependence on India, and go for energy cooperation in terms of hydroelectricity, solar, etc. That there can be more trade happening between both the countries, and more win-win situation happens because of the increased. In the opening editorial page, this article discusses about how the current inflation measure followed by the RBI is not right, and how we should go for a different measure. But the Reserve Bank may not give up the inflation measure, which is based on good economic theory followed by so many countries. So you can skip this article. It's technical in nature, and it is challenging the very inflation measure followed by RBI, which the RBI might not change in the coming future. So you can skip this article. In the explainer, we have an article about the GST compensations. Recently, the states have complained that the center has not released the compensation cess that they are supposed to get to the extent of almost 78,000 crores. This is use of almost 4 months compensation, and the center has said that it is not deposited the amount because there are no funds in the GST compensation cess fund, and whenever it gets fund, it will repay the compensation cess. The backdrop of this is, when the states wanted to accept for GST, they had to give up so many powers of various taxes that the states had. In order to do that, the center had promised the states that for a period of 5 years, they would be given a compensation cess. They would be given a compensation for the loss of the revenue, and that was supposed to come from the separate fund called the GST compensation fund, and the amount would be calculated based on the state's taxes with a 14% year on year increase for 5 years. And the amount for the compensation cess fund would come from the levies on various thin goods and luxury goods like pan masala, tobacco, coal, luxury cars, etc. As we discussed, now the central government has not paid the dues for almost 4 months, and when the states complained, the central government said that because it has not any funds left in the GST compensation, it's not able to pay, and whenever it gets funds, it is going to release the funds. And how much compensation has been paid to the state so far in this 5 years? Almost about to the extent of 7.3 lakh crores of compensation. And during the COVID pandemic, when there were no GST collections happening properly, and when the compensation cess was very less, the central government initially told that it is not going to pay the compensation cess, and when the states fought back, the central government borrowed the amount and they lent it to the amount, and now the compensation levy, which was supposed to end this year on June 30, it has been extended to 2025-20, and whatever the levy that the central government gets from this compensation cess, it would be used to repay the interest and loans that the central government took during the pandemic in order to give the compensation cess to the states. And recently we have been seeing news about how the GST collections have been increasing. So when the GST collections are increasing and they are hitting record highs, it also means that the states are going to get more compensation, and the state share of taxes also increase, because whatever the increase in GST, the share for both the center and state exists. Because of the increased collection, states also will get more shares now. And the article finally concludes by saying that because of the COVID pandemic, the states have to go in for heavy capital expenditure, and currently they don't have much funds, and whether the central government releases the funds in the form of, say, devolution, or giving through the form of tax collection, or by quickly giving the GST compensation, whatever it is, the central government releases funds to the states quickly, the states can properly plan and execute their infrastructural projects. Here in the World Press Freedom Index, for prelims we just need to know that this World Press Freedom Index, it is released by a watchdog called Reporters Without Borders, and India's ranking has reduced to 150. Out of the total 180 countries, India's ranking has fallen to 50. And the top 3 countries in this World Press Freedom Index are the Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark and Sweden. The business page, we have already discussed this rate increase. Here we'll look into this article. During the COVID pandemic, as we just discussed, the states were not having GST compensation cess. Their spending increased. The amount that they wanted to put it on infrastructure project and the social security schemes increased. So the states went for off-balance sheet borrowing. What are off-balance sheet borrowing? When the state doesn't directly borrow, but uses some of its subsidiary companies, say a public sector unit company, to borrow the funds and indirectly uses this amount for its expenditure, the loan would be shown on the balance sheet of this public sector undertaking and not shown on the state's balance sheet. Directly the state is using this amount because the state is the owner of this public sector undertaking, and the balance sheet of state is not having this loan amount. That is why it is known as off balance sheet borrowing, because you are showing it on someone else's borrow it, because the public sector unit is taking and you are not directly taking the loan. For example, even the central government followed the same thing. Previously, 2 years back, what the central government used to do, it used to heavily subsidize the food grains for the PDS through the Food Corporation of India. And the central government didn't pay the Food Corporation of India various dues that. So what used to happen? All the loans were shown on the this PSU's balance sheet. So the PSU's balance sheet, that is the Food Corporation of India's balance sheet, it was looking bad. But at the same time, the amount of dues that the central government was supposed to give to the FCI, it was not shown in the central government's balance sheet because it had directly not borrowed. It was due to the FCI, but it was shown on the FCI's balance sheet. Similarly, the states have done the same thing. They are borrowing indirectly through the public sector undertakings that they are holding, because of which fiscal deficits of states are going to increase in future. Whenever the states have to pay back to the public sector undertaking, the fiscal deficit of the states will increase, and the amount of funds that the states have to spend on the other social security measures and infrastructure amount available would reduce, because currently, even though the states are borrowing through the PSU, states have to pay back to the PSU someday. So whenever they pay back the interest amount and the principal amount, to that extent the funds available with the state for other purposes will reduce. These are the articles related to economy today. Thank you so much.